So 2 weeks ago we started talking and journeying through the book of Revelation, looking at the 7 letters to the 7 churches in Revelation. So if you were here and you got to be a part of that, then we're just going to continue on. If you weren't here, you can go online onto our website and listen to the first message. But we're going to continue on today. We're asking this question: what is the Spirit saying to our church and to churches in the 21st century? What's he saying? So we're reading about these, and we're trying to see what it might say to us. Remember the Apostle John? He's been exiled to Patmos, and he's been there, and this is what he starts to do. He has a revelation from God. God tells him to write these things down to the churches, and so he writes these down. He has a revelation of Jesus, not the crucified Jesus, but Jesus who is glorified and resurrected, King of heaven. And Jesus says, John, write this down. I'm going to dictate 7 letters to you, to the 7 churches, and you're going to deliver them to them. And so when you look at it, they're kind of located in and around modern-day Turkey is where they would be. We looked at Jesus' first letter last week was to Ephesus. And if you look at the letter to Ephesus, if you remember, they were a forgetful church. Why were they forgetful? Because they forgot their first love. So they were doing some great things, but Jesus says, hey, you're doing these great things, but here's something that you need to work on. You need to work on getting back to your first love. And we talked about that, have we ourselves done that? It's possible to go to church every single week, to go to Bible study. For me, growing up, it was, we had church Sunday morning, Sunday night, we had Wednesday night, we had CYC on Thursday, I think it was, or Tuesday night, I cannot remember exactly, but I was there all the time. It's possible to go through all of that and still, say you're a Christian, but still have no passion for Christ. No love for God. And it's possible to do that type of thing. When your passion for Christ grows cold, that happens. And if you remember the first message I talked about, I would love to have had a heart that could be encased in a block of ice. And the church of Ephesus kind of gave us all a scary warning. And we say, it's possible to do all the right things, but your heart can still be cold. Your heart can be frozen to the things of God. That you're not excited when somebody comes to know Christ for the first time. We should be excited when people are baptized. We should be excited when people is having a victory over an addiction or something. We should be excited and all that. But if we're kind of like, yay. Anybody ever watch Monty Python? Not that I, endorse all that stuff, but they said, and there was much rejoicing, and the people were like, yay. There was no excitement, no passion for any of that. We're losing our first love. Our faith is growing cold. And sometimes over the years, we can become, as we can become Christians for a long time, we can become people who are just going through the motions. We don't have this, I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice. We sing that song, and it's just like, yeah, God, you're with me, yeah. And there's nothing that changes us. And that's what happened in Ephesus. But Jesus warns them. He says, guys, it's not too late to repent of that, to turn from that, and go back to your first love. And Jesus says, I want you to go back and do the things that you did at the beginning. Remember when we became Christians? We were into the Bible a lot. We were asking questions. We were excited. Hey, the Bible talks about this. Did you know this? I've talked to people who became Christians just recently. At the time I'm talking to them, and they're so excited. They're just saying, "Hey, do you know this in the Bible?" And I'm thinking to myself, "Yes, I do. I've been studying the Bible for many years." No, we get excited with them and say, "That's wonderful that you're learning that," and then it makes us excited because we're like, "Yeah, that's in there. God is so good." And we need to have that. But today, we're actually going to continue on, and we're going to go look at the letter to the church in Smyrna. So Smyrna is actually located about 40 miles north of Ephesus, and these two cities kind of competed for top dog back then, which was the most influential city in the region. So Jesus writes this letter to the Christians who are living in Smyrna, Revelation 2, and it says this. It says, let's start at verse 1. It says this, write this letter to the angel of the church in Smyrna. This is the message from the one who is the first and the last, who is dead but now is alive. And know about your suffering and your poverty. I know I said verse 2 and I get myself all mixed up, I can't see. Verse 9. I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. I know the blasphemy of those opposing you. They say they are Jews, but they are not, because their synagogue belongs to Satan. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. The devil will throw some of you into prison to test you. You will suffer for 10 days, but if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. Anyone with ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what he's saying to the churches. Whoever is victorious will not be harmed by the second death. So who's speaking? The person that's speaking here is the crucified and resurrected Christ. He says, the one who died, I died on the cross. And then I came back to life. I rose again. And Jesus says, remember, I'm the first and the last. You know, I was the creator of creation. I'm the author of eternity. And I was there at the beginning. But there's a double meaning here in Revelation. There's always some kind of two plot lines going on, if you will, when we're reading these. So we talk about Jesus, but there's also a second meaning, because the city of Smyrna was destroyed in 600 BC. Literally, it was burnt to the ground. And they rebuilt it in 290 BC. And because of that, Smyrna had a nickname. And it was known as a city that had died and came back to life. And so there's maybe a hidden double meaning here, and Jesus may be kind of winking at them, saying, hey, I know your history, I know your background. And he's looking at them and saying, you know, I know the afflictions that are going on in your poverty and in your church. And I want you to really look at that. He says, I know about your suffering, I know about your afflictions, because what this really means is literally mean crushed. Or pressed between two plates. This wasn't a little bit of, you know, oh, I got to hang now and it's annoying. No, they were being crushed. They were being pressed between two plates. They were feeling the pressure. I know about your afflictions. You picture this in your mind, something like this. And I was going to try to have it up, and I couldn't find this. But anybody ever use a juice press? Anybody ever squeeze your own orange juice? You know how you put that in there, and what do? You take your handle and you put it in and you squeeze until you get all the juice out of that. And then what do? You keep squeezing, right? Because you don't want to not get any of that juice, because orange juice is so good, especially when it has no pulp in it. But you squeeze it and you get it out and you just keep doing that. And this is maybe what they were, something that you could be thinking about, is that this was really squeezing them, really putting the pressure to them. It's a nice image about that, but think about it though. The things that they were going through was not nice. They weren't getting maybe, being squeezed and pressed and it's like, oh, this is wonderful. No, there's things that are going on that were not good at all. And so Jesus is saying, I know your afflictions, and I know you're suffering. I know that you're getting crushed over these things. I know you're suffering. You're getting that way. This is the persecuted church. This is a church who is suffering deeply for their faith. And you think, well, Christians, why were the Christians in Smyrna getting crushed? It's because they refused to worship Caesar back then. See, the city of Smyrna had this fierce allegiance to Rome, and when Rome came to power in that region, Smyrna was kind of the first to kind of jump on the Caesar train, if you will. In fact, they were the first city in the region to construct a temple to Rome that was the goddess of Rome, and it was designed for all their citizens to worship. The Roman Emperor Caesar was considered a lowercase god at this time. And so you understand, every year the prefect of Rome would come, and every citizen of Smyrna had to go to the temple and drop a pinch of incense into the fire at Caesar's altar and say, Caesar is Lord. So this is kind of what was going on. But they're like, we're not going to say Caesar is Lord, the church there. Instead, their worship services and their churches, they said Jesus is Lord. And so they're getting persecuted because of this. There's only one God, there's only one ruler, one master who's worthy of worship, and his name is Jesus. And so you can see what's going to happen. They're going to get persecuted. And it was actually the Emperor Domitian. He was a murderous thug, and he launched an all-out campaign to crush the Christian church, and they lost everything. Believers in Smyrna lost their businesses, they lost their properties, they lost their families, they lost their income because worshiping Caesar was just like what you did as a good Roman citizen. In short, you had Rome's blessing and protection. So if you didn't worship Caesar, they're coming after you. And so when Christians said, no, Caesar's not Lord, Jesus is Lord, they were like, how dare you defy the empire? And as I'm looking at this, and I think of Star Wars, like, you can't defy the empire here, but they were not nice, and so they would go, and Rome said, you go crush them, you take care of them, and you just do this to them. And so they did. They made it legal to physically beat Christians, to kidnap them, to throw them into prison, and ultimately they just lost their freedom, their businesses, their welfare, and some lost their lives because they would not bow to Caesar and say that Caesar was Lord. There's scores of Christians who were executed for their faith, martyred for their faith in Jesus. There was one guy by the name of Polycarp, and he was a pastor of Smyrna at that time, and he was hauled into the middle of the city stadium where the Olympics were being held, and they tied Polycarp to a pole, called the whole city out to watch him, and they burned him alive. But when the flames didn't immediately kill him, they stabbed him to death. These guys are not nice in what they did. And the people in the city cheered and watched this. So you understand that Smyrna, the Christians were getting crushed. They were getting persecuted. And they were getting squeezed. I know your afflictions, and I know your poverty, yet you are rich, Jesus says. How can you say that? We'll see in a minute. If we keep reading, it says, I know the slain are those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. And I have to unpack this for a little bit here. Jesus was Jewish. John was Jewish. And the early church, early Jesus movement is mostly made up of Jewish converts at this point. But at this moment that Christianity is actually beginning to distinguish itself from Judaism, some of the Jewish synagogue at Smyrna saw Christianity as a cult. They were like, this is a cancer that needs to be removed. And so they attacked it with slander. They attacked it with slander. You know, slander is character assassination, if you will. It's when you spread lies and rumors and fake news, and you say that there's trouble in the city and there's riots going on, and the Christians are the ones to blame for it, and yet the Christians are not the ones that are doing it all. And so understand, it's not Jewish, it's demonically motivated persecution at this point. And Jesus says, I know your afflictions, I know your poverty, I know about all the slander that people are doing towards you guys. And he says, don't be afraid about what you're about to suffer. What you're about to suffer. I tell you, this is, the devil put some of you in prison, he says. And you're going to suffer this persecution. How long? 10 days. If we're honest, it's hard to wrap your head around things like that. A persecuted Christian. And so for some of us, it's like, we grew up in Canada. We do not have religious persecution like they do in other countries around the world today. We don't. We can come to church on Sunday, we can sit in the pews, and we can worship God, do everything that we do, and there's no fear whatsoever. But there's countries around the world that they meet secretly, and at any time the door can be burst open, and people come in with machine guns and demand that you recant your faith, that you say, no, I'm not a Christian, no, God's not real. If you don't do it, I'm going to, as they used to say, years ago, it's curtains for you, Muggsy. They're going to take you out. They're going to kill you. And yet those churches are growing. They're meeting together because of this passion. They want to worship God. But we don't have that. And sometimes I think it's hard for us to wrap our minds around a church being persecuted to the extent that they're being persecuted because we have the freedoms we have here in Canada. You know, number one on a list of countries of persecution is North Korea. You can look this up. It has been there, I think probably, I don't know, it was been 14 years or something, I can't remember, but it was one of the top, it is the top one. And I read that you can either be imprisoned, your family imprisoned, or they just shoot you on sight. And so they're making it very hard for you to be a Christian in this country. We don't have that. It can cost you your business, your reputation, it can cost you your family, it can cost you your life. And so sometimes I look at, well, we're worshiping God, and maybe, and I say this maybe for me, that I come in with this maybe apathetic attitude. It's like, I'm here. If I want to be, I want to worship God. When I look at people in other countries, though, who these things can happen, and they are on fire. They're meeting together. They're not letting fear of death stop them from getting together to worship God. And I love that. When you see these things, it's like, oh man. The Bible tells us to pray for believers around the world, and I really think that we need to do that if we don't. Because they're going to do things that we are probably not experiencing at all, but we need to pray for them. So the church in Smyrna receives no correction, do they? Did you hear any correction in there to them? Ephesus, they were doing good, but they also had something to work on, so Jesus corrects them. Smyrna does not have that. It's just comfort and encouragement because of all the persecution, all the suffering that is going on there today. And maybe we need that today to remember the word affliction. It does mean to have life crushed out of us and squeezed out of us. But here's the thing. God is with us even during these times. And it can make us stronger. And it can change us if we allow it to. And maybe today you're here and you're like, I've got so much pressure coming in right now. I'm feeling crushed for something. And we look at the imagery of the juice press and we just feel it being pressed, squeezed out of us, and we're being just squeezed and crushed. Well, He cares about us so much that He is with every single one of us. And our Father in heaven wrote this letter to the church, which we're a part of. Even though it's written to Smyrna, it still speaks to us today. What's it say? He sees you. I see your struggles. I see your affliction. I'm there. So the question my answer today is, what are you facing right now that you feel like you're getting it just squeezed out of you? Maybe there's something that is so much more, you just can't take anymore. You're being so squeezed with this. Is there financial pressure? Relationship breakdowns? Is there overbearing temptations to sin? Satan can use all of these things to weaken us and weaken us. And we're just like, I don't know if I can do any more of this. Remember, though, that our Savior knows exactly what we're going through. And I love that. And this is comfort, this is hope, and this is what helped the church in Smyrna. This is what's going to help us today as well. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 18 says this, we're told since that Jesus has gone through suffering and testing, He is able to help us when we are being tested, Hebrews tells us. So Jesus wrote this letter to Christians in Smyrna to let them know that I am so close to you, that when my child is suffering, I'm going to be there. I remember one time the kids were sick, and I was just asking questions like why can't I take the sickness from my child and take it on me so they don't have to suffer? Why? Well, I wish, because they're at an age where they couldn't say, Daddy, my tummy hurts or my throat hurts or whatever it is. They couldn't speak. But they're suffering with this sickness of a nasty cold or flu or whatever it was. And I wanted to take that, and I know as a father and as a mother, we were right there with them and comforting them. And that's what God is with us as well. You're going through it. He is right there with us, and He's comforting us, and He is with us. God says, I'm with you and I can help you. So how did Jesus start this letter? He says that He is the one who died and came to life. And says, never forget the one writing. This is the one who was crushed on the cross for you. He went through all this for you, and I know what it means to suffer. I know what it's like to have pain and poverty in this here. And our Savior was ridiculed, He was arrested and executed on a Roman cross. And He says, and I came back to life, and so will you in this, that you have victory over this. When you're going through suffering, you're part of a larger story of what God is doing. There's the crucifixion part, the crushing part, but as Jesus was raised and had defeated sin and darkness, that we can, through Christ, have victory over whatever it is that's going on with us. He says, whatever you're going through, I'll be with you to go through that with you. So Jesus is saying, you know what? In the middle of whatever it is, a medical test, financial test maybe, and whenever you're going to a doctor, you've got somebody who's really off the rails and going on a path that you wish they wouldn't go, and God's not in that mix for them. Through all of these things, God is saying, I am with you no matter what you're going through. I'm with you. Be encouraged with that. And He goes on to say, you're rich. What's He talking about here? I know what you're suffering in your poverty, He says, but you are rich. How could Jesus say this? He's not obviously talking about material wealth and not talking about, He's talking about spiritual wealth. Even though the believers in Smyrna were getting crushed, they were getting persecuted, He's like, there's something much deeper in that. You are rich in faith. And it means a lot of things. It means that Christ actually gives you the ability to experience joy even when you're suffering, even when you're getting crushed and so much things are going on. There's things that you're able to grow in your faith and let God to grow you and work in your life. And that can be painful at times to go through something like suffering. But how many people on the other side of it had said, I grew in my faith. I let God do a work in me, and man, I am so much different than what I was before. And I love that. We can be, things can be at their worst in our lives, but Christ is at His best. He's made perfect in our weakness. His strength is made perfect. So I want to tell you just a couple of things here today as we go to close out. First thing is this. I want to read the 4 verses, these, as I'll put them up on the screen here as well. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. You may not be suffering right now, but don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I wish I was saying, don't be afraid because you're not going to suffer. I wish I could tell you, you know what? No, you don't have to worry about it. You are never going to have to suffer again. I wish I could tell you that, but I can't. We are going to suffer. There's things that are going to happen. That's just part of life, part of who God has for us. There's things that we go through that we suffer, but don't be afraid of that. Don't live in fear, because fear can be paralyzing. Fear is from Satan. Perfect love casts out all fear, the Bible says. Don't be afraid of it. But look why Jesus says don't be afraid. He says the devil's going to put you in prison and test you, and you will suffer persecution. For how long? 10 days. In other words, a week and a half. What's the point? All suffering is temporary. You go through suffering, it's not forever. Suffering is temporary. It's not forever in contrast to eternity. It's just like a season of suffering is short. It's a fixed point. God doesn't deny pain. He acknowledges we will go through some things that are very intense in our life. But it will not last forever. In 10 days, it's not literally 10 days. It's kind of symbolic of a short period of time. And so if we're getting crushed today, Jesus says, don't be afraid. And secondly, he says this as well, be faithful even to the point of death. Even to the point of death. And he says, I will give you life as your victor's crown. So what do we do when we're getting crushed? When Christians suffer, first Jesus says, don't fear that. Second, be faithful. Can we work with that today? Don't fear it. Be faithful. Be faithful. Don't be afraid of it. And I know it's painful, it's hard. We don't understand what God's doing. We don't understand that. I'm not saying, that God sends suffering. Sometimes there's, like with Job, he allows things to happen. And so on. Sometimes suffering is because of our own stupidity, I think. Those things happen. But there's things that he can use all of it for our good. He can grow us. We could be going through something where it's like, I don't get it. It does not make sense. Why would God allow this to happen? Well, God can use that. And on the other side of it, man, we could be growing and gone through something that helps us for the next time or somebody else when they do that. Remember the largest story in all of this. And I love what is verse 11 as it goes with every letter. It says, anyone with ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what he's saying to the churches. We need to understand it. We need to let it sink in. Anybody ever watch the Olympics? The Olympics, and everyone knows that when you win and you get to the podium, you're going to get your medal. You get a medal, and you put it on your chest, right? Well, back in Smyrna's time, they hosted the Olympic Games in their stadium. And when you endured and you won the race, you didn't get a gold medal or a silver medal or whatever hung around you. They actually had kind of like a laurel wreath, and they put it on your head. It was a victor's crown. It was made out of olive leaves and bay leaves. And so when you overcame the trial, you got the victory, you got a crown. I think it's a really neat image that Jesus talks to an Olympic town and says, because he says, if you remain faithful even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. That's a victor's crown. And so Jesus is using this to them. He says, hey, I've got a special honor just for those who endure. I will reward you with a crown of life. And I love that imagery. So don't be afraid, folks, of suffering that Jesus may allow to come into our lives, that we may be going through. Satan may be like, I'm going to get them. And you don't be afraid of it, because with God, He's with you. He'll give you the strength to get through it. And be faithful. I want a crown. I've won some medals in my day. Gold, I don't think I've ever won gold. But just to have that victor's crown because I remained faithful. I wasn't afraid of it. It's just an amazing thing. So what can we learn today? We can learn that God is with us through it all. And not to get so mad at God and say, whoa, you're letting this happen. It's too much for me. I'm walking away. I love it, the ones who are going through something and they remain faithful to God and they say, God, just, what can I learn? Help me through this. And they're just continuing to put their faith in Him. And on the other side of it, they're growing and there's someone who is, you can tell God's working in their lives. That's who I want to be when suffering comes. Be encouraged today. Let me pray for you today. Father,